The sun was setting, and Jake was walking home alone. It was just another ordinary evening. Or so he thought. Then, out of nowhere, a loud roar filled the air. Motorcycles. 4 bikers surrounded him, blocking his path. Their leather jackets, dark helmets, and the way they grinned told Jake one thing. They weren't here to be friendly. "You lost, kid," one of them sneered. The others laughed. Jake stayed calm, too calm. They had no idea who they were messing with. By the time they realized their mistake, it was already too late. Before we continue the story, let us know, where are you watching from? Jake Carter was just a 17-year-old high school student. Quiet, focused, and never looking for trouble. But if trouble found him, that was a different story. What the bikers didn't know was that Jake had been training in martial arts since he was 5 years old. His father, a former military combat instructor, had made sure his son could defend himself in any situation. Jake wasn't just strong, he was trained. But to the bikers, he was just another kid, an easy target. The street was quiet, almost too quiet. It was a back road on the edge of town, where streetlights flickered, and most people didn't hang around after dark. That's where Jake found himself face to face with the 4 men. They were big, rough-looking, and completely confident that they were in control. One of them revved his engine loudly, grinning. "What do we have here? A little lost boy?" Another smirked, stepping off his bike. "Might want to hand over your wallet, kid. Make this easy on yourself." Jake stood still, completely unfazed. He wasn't trapped with them. They were trapped with him. Jake's heart beat steadily. 4 men. Bigger, older, stronger. But strength didn't matter when you didn't know how to use it. He had faced opponents before. Trained ones. Fighters who actually knew how to throw a punch. But these guys, they were just muscle and ego. The leader stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. "Let's make this simple, kid. Hand over your wallet, and maybe we won't hurt you." Jake met his eyes. He could tell a lot about a person by how they moved, the way they shifted their weight, the tension in their hands, the way their eyes flickered before a strike. And this guy? He wasn't a fighter. He was just a bully. Jake sighed. "Not happening." The second biker chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, we got ourselves a tough guy." Another one spat on the ground. "Listen, punk, this ain't a game. We're giving you a chance to walk away in one piece." Jake tilted his head. "You ever heard the saying, 'Pick on someone your own size'?" The bikers exchanged looks before bursting into laughter. One of them wiped fake tears from his eyes. "Man, this kid's got jokes." The leader's smirk twisted into something colder. He was done laughing. "Enough talking," he muttered. "Let's teach this punk a lesson." The biggest one lunged first. Big mistake. Jake sidestepped effortlessly, barely moving, just a small shift of his body. The biker's punch hit nothing but air. Before the man could react, Jake's elbow snapped forward, connecting with his ribs. A loud grunt filled the air. The man staggered back, gasping for air. His face twisted in confusion. Jake had barely moved, and yet he was already winning. The other bikers weren't laughing anymore. One of them muttered, "What the hell?" The leader's eyes narrowed. He hadn't expected resistance. Jake stood calmly, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't even breathing hard. "Come on," he said, voice even. "That can't be all you got." The second biker, a wiry guy with a jagged scar down his cheek, charged in anger. Rookie mistake. Anger made people reckless. He swung wildly, aiming for Jake's jaw. But Jake ducked effortlessly, stepping inside his guard. Before the biker could reset, Jake's fist shot out, a precise, sharp punch to the ribs. The man gasped, doubling over. Jake didn't let him recover. A sharp kick to the back of his knee. The biker collapsed. Now there were only two left standing, and suddenly they didn't seem so confident anymore. The leader's jaw clenched. "You little—" Jake tilted his head. "Still think I'm the one with no choice." For the first time, the bikers felt it. They had messed with the wrong guy. A shift in power. The third biker hesitated, his hands trembling slightly. He was the youngest of the group, not as cocky as the others. "Don't just stand there," the leader barked. "Get him!" The younger biker swallowed hard, but he moved. He tried to be faster, more careful. But Jake had already assessed his weaknesses. The guy led with his right foot. That meant he favored right-handed punches. Predictable. Jake let him throw the first punch, but before it even landed, he caught the guy's wrist. One swift motion, a twist and a pull. The biker was spun around, his own momentum throwing him off balance. Before he could recover, Jake grabbed the back of his jacket and sent him flying into the pavement. 3 down. The leader was the only one left standing. But now he wasn't smirking anymore. The leader took a step back. He had underestimated Jake, and now he knew it. He pulled out a pocket knife. The blade glinted under the dim streetlight. Jake's expression didn't change. The leader grinned, trying to act like he still had control. "What now, kid? Let's see how good you are against this." Jake sighed. Knives were always messy, but he had trained for this too. The leader lunged, aiming for Jake's ribs. Jake moved before he could blink. A quick step to the side, a controlled grip on the wrist, and a sharp twist. The knife clattered to the ground. Before the leader could react, Jake struck. One solid punch to the solar plexus. The leader gasped, air knocked out of his lungs. A second hit to the jaw. The man dropped to his knees, eyes wide in shock. Jake leaned in slightly, his voice quiet but firm. "You should have walked away." The leader groaned, completely defeated. The aftermath. The street was silent. The bikers, who had walked in with total confidence, were now scattered across the pavement. Groaning, humiliated, beaten. Jake adjusted his hoodie and turned away. He had nothing more to prove. Then, from the distance, another engine roared. A black SUV pulled up. Jake's father stepped out, a former Special Forces soldier. The bikers saw him, and their faces drained of color. Jake's father took in the scene, then looked at his son. "You good?" he asked. Jake nodded. "Yeah." His father turned to the bikers. His voice was calm, but filled with authority. "I don't think we'll be seeing you around here again," he said. The bikers scrambled to their feet, stumbling as they ran for their bikes. Jake watched them go. He knew they'd never come back. They had learned their lesson. And from that night on, no one ever dared to mess with him again. The street was silent, except for the low rumble of an approaching SUV. The bikers, still groaning from the beating Jake had just given them, barely noticed at first. Then, the SUV came to a stop, and the driver's door swung open. Jake's father wasn't just any man. He was a former Special Forces combat instructor, a man who had trained soldiers, seen real fights, and faced dangers these bikers couldn't begin to imagine. His presence alone changed everything. The leader of the bikers, Todd, was still gasping for air, one hand clutching his ribs where Jake had struck him. He tried to push himself up, but the pain made him stagger. One of the younger bikers muttered under his breath, "Oh man, we are so screwed." Mark's eyes swept over the scene. 4 grown men, all struggling to get up. His son, standing tall, calm, completely in control. He nodded slightly. "Looks like you handled yourself just fine." Jake smirked. They weren't much of a challenge. The remaining bikers flinched. The humiliation was already unbearable. But now, they were truly afraid. Todd, still struggling to stand, finally managed to face Mark. His hands trembled. Mark crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. "What's your name?" Todd hesitated. "Todd." Mark nodded. "Todd, do you know who you just messed with?" Todd swallowed hard. I didn't know, okay? We thought he was just some kid." Mark's voice was even. "And now?" Todd licked his lips. "Now we know better." Mark didn't blink. "Good. Because if I ever hear that you or your friends so much as look at my son the wrong way again, I won't just let him handle it. I'll handle it myself." The weight of those words hung heavy in the air. Jake had already beaten them physically. He had proven that they had no chance against him. But his father, they didn't even want to find out what he was capable of. Todd tried to force a grin, attempting to regain some control. "Look, man, we didn't mean any real harm. We were just messing around." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Messing around? You pulled a knife." The younger biker, his hands still shaking, spoke up. It wasn't supposed to go that far. We just wanted to scare you a little." Mark let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "You don't get to decide how far things go," he said. "That's the mistake you made tonight." The bikers looked at each other, guilt settling in. Mark took another step forward. The bikers didn't move. "If you're smart," he continued, "you'll remember this moment for the rest of your lives." The bikers nodded quickly. Mark's eyes flicked down to the knife that still lay on the pavement. Without breaking eye contact, he stepped on the blade, snapping it in half. Silence. Jake smirked. They got the message. His father didn't just want them to walk away, he wanted them to never come back. And the bikers, they were too scared to do anything but listen. Todd took a slow step backward, hands raised in surrender. "We're done, man," he said quickly. "We're out of here." Mark studied them for a moment, then nodded. Smart choice. But just as the bikers turned toward their motorcycles, he spoke one last time. "One more thing." They froze. Mark's voice was calm, steady. "There's a lesson here, boys. Strength isn't about size. Power isn't about intimidation. Real strength is knowing when to walk away." The bikers nodded furiously, desperate to leave. Jake crossed his arms. "So, are you walking away now? Or do you want another round?" Todd swallowed. "We're done. We're out of here." Mark tilted his head. "Then go." The bikers scrambled to their motorcycles. Their hands trembled as they grabbed the handlebars, their movements awkward and stiff from the injuries Jake had given them. They revved their engines and, without another word, sped off into the night, humiliated, defeated, and terrified. Jake watched them disappear down the road, his heart rate finally slowing. It was over. His father glanced at him. "You all right?" Jake smirked. "I was never not all right." Mark chuckled. "That's my boy." He walked over and patted Jake on the shoulder. Not as a father comforting his son, but as one warrior acknowledging another. "You handled yourself well," Mark said. "Kept your cool, didn't overdo it." Jake nodded. "You always told me, control is power." Mark smiled. "And you proved it tonight. For the bikers, this night would haunt them forever. They had walked in thinking they were the predators. They had left knowing they were the prey. Jake didn't just beat them. He made them afraid. And the worst part? They had no one to blame but themselves. They had thought they were picking on a helpless kid. Instead, they had walked straight into a nightmare. Jake took one last look down the empty street. The fight was over. His life would go on as normal. But if those bikers ever saw him again, they would cross the street and pray he didn't notice them. And Jake? He wouldn't even have to say a word. Because real power doesn't need to be spoken. It's understood. Jake had won. The bikers had fled humiliated, bruised, and terrified. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that this wasn't just another fight. This was a warning. Jake's father looked at him, eyes unreadable. "You ready to go home?" Jake nodded. "Yeah." But just as they turned toward the SUV, his father's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Stay here," he said, stepping a few feet away. Jake didn't have to ask. His father was always handling things, always involved in something that no one else needed to know about. He leaned against the SUV, watching the road. Then, in the distance, he saw headlights. A single motorcycle. It wasn't one of the bikers from earlier. This guy was different. He didn't speed down the road like an amateur. He moved slow, steady, controlled. Jake recognized that movement immediately. This wasn't some random biker. This was someone trained. His father's call ended. He turned back, his face completely serious. "We need to go. Now." Jake didn't hesitate. He got in the SUV. His father pulled out onto the road, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. A few minutes passed in silence. Jake's father kept his eyes on the road, his grip on the wheel tighter than usual. Jake had seen that look before. It meant something was wrong. "Dad," he finally said, "who was that guy?" His father didn't answer right away. Then, without taking his eyes off the road, he said, "Someone I hoped I wouldn't have to deal with again." Jake's stomach tightened. "Again?" "You know him?" Mark sighed. "Not personally, but I know his type." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" Mark exhaled through his nose. "Those bikers back there, they were just street-level punks, bullies who thought they were tough." Jake nodded. "Yeah, and they learned their lesson." His father glanced at him. "But bullies, they have leaders." The weight of those words sank in immediately. Jake sat up straighter. "Are you saying—" "That wasn't just some guy riding past," Mark interrupted. "He was watching. He was sent." Jake's pulse quickened. "Sent by who?" His father's jaw clenched. "Someone who doesn't like loose ends." Jake didn't speak. He knew when to listen. Mark continued, his voice calm but firm. "There are people out there who run things from the shadows, the kind of people you don't see until it's too late. You just embarrassed 4 guys who probably work for someone much worse." Jake felt the adrenaline creeping back into his veins. "So, you think they'll come back?" Mark didn't hesitate. "I know they will." They pulled into their driveway. The house was dark, silent. Everything looked normal. But Jake knew better. He turned to his father. "What do we do?" Mark put the SUV in park but didn't move. "We wait." Jake frowned. "Wait for what?" His father finally turned to him. For them to make their next move. Jake knew his father well enough to understand what that meant. They were already preparing. Jake had spent years training, learning discipline, control, and patience. He had fought bigger, stronger opponents. But this wasn't just about fighting. This was about war. His father leaned forward, resting his arms on the steering wheel. "Listen to me, Jake. You handled yourself well tonight. But this isn't over. And when the real threat comes, you don't react. You anticipate." Jake nodded, locking the words in his mind. Reacting was what amateurs did. Anticipating was what professionals did. "Get some rest," Mark said. "Tomorrow, we prepare." Jake didn't argue. He knew what was coming. And this time, it wouldn't just be a fight. It would be a battle. The house was quiet, but Jake's mind wasn't. His father's words echoed in his head. "We wait. When the real threat comes, you don't react. You anticipate." Jake had thought the fight was over. The bikers were gone. They had been beaten, humiliated, and warned. But now, He understood something much bigger. This wasn't about 4 bikers. This was about who they answered to. And whoever that was, they weren't going to let this go. Jake sat in the kitchen, staring at the table while his father poured himself a cup of coffee. Mark finally spoke. "You're thinking too much." Jake looked up. "So, you're saying I should just relax?" Mark leaned against the counter. "Number, I'm saying, don't let fear control you." Jake exhaled. "I'm not scared." His father studied him. "Number, you're not. But you're starting to understand what real threats look like. And that's good. Because fear isn't the problem. Ignorance is." Jake nodded slowly. "So, what do we do now?" Mark took a sip of coffee, calm as ever. "We live our lives. We go about our business." Jake frowned. "That's it?" Mark's gaze sharpened. "And we stay ready." Jake had always trained hard. But the next morning, when his father woke him up before dawn for another session, he trained even harder. They went through drills, punches, counters, defense, offense, perfecting movements. Because in a real fight, you don't think. You act. Mark circled him, arms crossed. "You already know how to win fights. But now you learn how to control them." Jake wiped sweat from his forehead. "And what if they don't come back?" His father's expression didn't change. "They will." Jake nodded. "Then I'll be ready." For the next few days, nothing happened. No strange cars, no unfamiliar faces, no more bikers lurking in the shadows. But Jake knew better than to let his guard down. Then, on the 4th night, something changed. Jake was heading home when he noticed something just outside their driveway. A cigarette, still burning, crushed into the pavement. He glanced up. No one was there. But someone had been. He didn't panic. He didn't look around frantically. Instead, he simply walked inside. His father was already at the table, checking his phone. He barely looked up. "Saw it?" Jake nodded. "Yeah." Mark smiled slightly. "Good." Jake sat down across from him. "They're watching." His father leaned back. "Of course they are." Jake exhaled. "So, what now?" Mark took his time before answering. "Now, we let them know we see them too." The next day, Mark took Jake to a parking lot behind an old gym. It wasn't for training, it wasn't for a fight, it was for a message. Mark parked and got out. Jake followed. 2 men were waiting. Not bikers, but the kind of men who didn't need to show off to be dangerous. Jake didn't flinch. Mark spoke first. "Tell your boss that my son already handled his problem. It's over." One of the men, a tall guy with a scar along his jawline, smirked. "That's not how it works." Mark didn't blink. "It does tonight." The air was thick with tension. Then the second man, older, quieter, more dangerous than the first, spoke. "No more trouble?" Mark nodded. "No more trouble." A long silence followed. Then the older man nodded once. "Then we're done here." And just like that, it was over. On the drive home, Jake finally spoke. "That's it?" Mark glanced at him. "You expected a fight?" Jake shrugged. "Maybe." Mark smiled. "Fights are easy. Wars take strategy." Jake sat with that for a moment. "So they won't come back?" Mark exhaled. "Not unless they're stupid." Jake smirked. "And if they are?" His father smiled back. "Then they get reminded." And with that, Jake understood something that no amount of training could teach. Fights weren't about winning. They were about control. And now, Jake wasn't just trained to fight. He was trained to win without ever needing to throw a punch. And just like that, it was over. Jake had thought this would end with a fight. He had expected more bikers, another ambush, maybe even a full-on battle. But instead, he learned something even more valuable. The strongest person in the room isn't the one who fights the hardest. It's the one who controls the fight before it even happens. Those bikers? They were never in control. Not when they surrounded Jake that night. Not when they fled in fear. And definitely not when their boss realized that coming after him would be a mistake. Jake didn't just win a fight. He won the war without even needing to throw another punch. And that was the greatest victory of all. Now let me ask you, what would you have done if you were in Jake's place? Would you have fought harder, walked away, or handled it just like he did? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think. And if you loved this story, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more real-life stories that prove that power isn't about strength. It's about knowing when to use it. See you in the next one.